The primary cause of America's entry into World War II was the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941. The Americans staked their wrath against Japan on the passage of time. When they first entered the conflict, they were dissatisfied with the employment of armed power. Instead, they harnessed their intelligence in order to kill the Japanese people's spirit on all fronts. One of the few women working for the Office of Strategic Services, the intelligence service in charge of the disinformation campaign, was journalist Elizabeth McIntosh. Two events have left lasting scars in U.S.-Japanese relations. Japanese warplanes unexpectedly attacked American soldiers at Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, inflicting great casualties. That attack, which resulted in the deaths of 2,400 American soldiers, served as justification for the country's entry into World War II. The U.S. unleashing an atomic bomb on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki was the second occurrence. August 6, 1945, saw the first bomb fell on Hiroshima, and August 9, 1945 saw the second on Nagasaki. At least 240,000 people were killed by the two bombs, which also prompted Japan to give up. The first foreign attack on the United States of America over its soil occurred at Pearl Harbor in the Hawaiian archipelago. America's pride suffered a terrible hit as a result. Therefore, the Americans deployed a level of force that had never been used before. For the benefit of governments or organizations, they gather and analyze sensitive information. They carry out covert operations, infiltration, and other forms of surveillance to obtain information about prospective threats or to their advantage. Because of the often secretive nature of their employment, it calls for extreme discretion and professionalism. They could work covertly or assume different identities. They need a high level of skill, training, and mental toughness for their work, which can be dangerous. Their practice frequently involves emotional deceit and manipulation. When the United States of America entered World War II, it was necessary to repair the naval vessels that the Japanese had sunk. The attack on Pearl Harbor left a lasting shock. The Japanese force was not anticipated by the Americans. They also understood that in order to win the war and achieve victory, an external intelligence system must be established that is not only capable of gathering information and news but also has the capacity to influence the opponent's plans and shape his public opinion. This realization came at that precise moment, and not earlier. President Franklin Roosevelt commanded the establishment of the Office of Strategic Service, an organization for the Chiefs of Staff of the American Army, in response to all of this. Its goal is to organize intelligence operations behind hostile lines. The events held by this office also served the purposes of using propaganda, carrying out sabotage activities, and making plans for the end of the war. One of the first women hired to work in this agency, which was a parallel war tool just as damaging as the traditional war tools, was Elizabeth McIntosh. On March 1, 1915, Elizabeth McIntosh was born. She was raised in Honolulu, Hawaii, where her parents were journalists. She proceeded to Washington to continue her university studies, which she completed with a diploma in journalism in the year 1935, and worked as a reporter for many newspaper companies after falling in love with the Japanese language and learning it to the point where she could speak it fluently. When the attack took place, she wasn't far from Pearl Harbor. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, Betty went back to Washington, where she reported on Eleanor Roosevelt, the First Lady of the United States of America, and her activities. She reported on government affairs as well. With her journalistic work and her command of the Japanese language, Elizabeth McIntosh caught the notice of those in charge of the Office of Strategic Services in 1943, and she was invited to join this intelligence service. Following a training phase, Betty was assigned the responsibility of intervening on the level of postcards sent by soldiers serving in Japan to their families in India when she was dispatched to India in July 1944. One of the few women hired for what came to be known as Morale Operations was Elizabeth. Betty had to read the contents of the postcards and act by deleting words and substituting them with other words of discontent. Julia Child, who subsequently became a chef and TV host, was her closest co-worker. She attained widespread recognition for her culinary skills and was credited with popularizing French cooking in the United States of America. By changing the messages that Japanese soldiers scribbled on the cards they sent to their loved ones, Elizabeth McIntosh and her colleague were using controlled disinformation to undermine the Japanese people's morale and undermine their faith in their military. Instead of terms that talk about persistence and imply fortitude, what the soldiers put down was frequently reworked as postcards for officials. Everything that served to undermine the Japanese spirit was legal during that parallel conflict. Elizabeth's crew included calligraphers and painters who were skilled at designing letters that looked like the original so that the situation would not be revealed. Betty relocated to China for a new duty that involved fieldwork in addition to disinformation. One of Elizabeth McIntosh's activities involved detonating a train carrying Japanese soldiers. She created Black Shoe, a bomb that had the appearance of a lump of coal, and gave it to a Chinese operative of the Office of Strategic Service. The Chinese agent boarded the train, waited for the right moment, dropped the Black Shoe bomb into the house of fire, and then fled, according to her memoirs, which she wrote decades after World War II. While crossing a bridge, the train was observed bursting. Elizabeth did not forget to express her regret in her diary for the large number of victims. Betty McIntosh had the good fortune to create and prepare leaflets encouraging Chinese people to despise the Japanese. Parallel to World War II, the Japanese-Chinese War has been raging since 1937. When the Japanese invaded Manchuria in 1931, the Chinese launched a campaign of resistance. Elizabeth and the rest of the Office of Strategic Service staff capitalized on the lasting impression that war had on the Japanese people. She developed the story script after deciding that one of the most well-known Chinese novelists should read it aloud on the radio in order to gain wide distribution. The intention of such tale was to evoke intense distress in both Chinese and Japanese listeners. The narrative was created in a way that mixes divination and the delicacy of narration. She predicts that Japan will witness significant events. We have determined from the stars that something we cannot reveal because to its savagery will result in the eradication of an entire region in Japan, according to the Chinese literature. On that day, following the radio transmission of this story, the prophecy was fulfilled when the United States of America dropped its atomic bomb on Hiroshima. 3 days later, the American military attacked Nagasaki with a second atomic weapon. The 2 American atomic bombs dropped on the 2 cities in Japan were among the last successful military operations. After them, the war came to a conclusion, and on September 2, 1945, Japan submitted. The shock of the 2 atomic bombs was intense, and the Japanese sea and ground forces were on the verge of collapse. In order to agree to the Allied terms as laid out in the Potsdam Declaration, Emperor Hirohito was forced to convene the Supreme War Council. By exacting retaliation on Japan for attacking America inside its own territory at Pearl Harbor, the Americans were able to win the war. World War II left the Japanese devastated and discouraged. Within a year of the end of the war, the Office of Strategic Service was disbanded, but Elizabeth McIntosh continued her work in the American intelligence services, moving to the General Command of the American Armies, then to the Department of State, and at United Nations headquarters in New York. At the same time, she resumed her activities as a journalist and worked for Voice of America. Elizabeth McIntosh joined the CIA in 1958 and worked there until her retirement in 1973. Elizabeth wrote 2 memoirs over the course of her long life, the first of which, The Spy Girl, was published in 1947, and the second of which, The Spy Sisters, Women of the Office of Strategic Service, was published in 1998, more than 50 years after The Spy Girl. Betty was one of the centenarians on June 15, 2015, and she had 3 marriages. She passed away shortly after turning 100.